This is a reading from the Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. Chapter 15, An Example and Illustration. In order to illustrate what I have said, I will give you a passage from the life of St. Bernard, as it is related by a wise and learned writer. It is a common thing for nearly all who are just beginning to serve God and are not as yet accustomed to the withdrawal of His sensible grace or to the vicissitudes of the spiritual life, when they lose the flavor of fervent devotion and the pleasant light which beckons them forward on the path heavenward, to lose courage suddenly and sink into despondency and sadness of heart. And those who are experienced in this say that it is because human nature cannot remain long hungry without any gratification, either heavenly or earthly. And inasmuch as souls raised above themselves by the enjoyment of spiritual delights easily renounce visible objects, when, by God's disposal, their spiritual joy is taken away, and they being likewise bare of temporal joys, and not being as yet accustomed patiently to wait the return of their true Son, imagine themselves to be neither in heaven nor on earth, but to be buried in perpetual darkness, wherefore they languish and groan, becoming burdensome and wearisome, above all to themselves. Such was the case during the journey of which I speak, with a member of the company by name Geoffrey de Perron, but who was but newly dedicated to the service of God. Geoffrey, becoming suddenly dry and barren of consolation, and absorbed with his inward darkness, began to recur to thoughts of his worldly friends, his relatives, and the worldly goods which he had forsaken. Through such thoughts his temptation grew so strong that he could not hide it. And one of his most intimate companions, perceiving it in his countenance, prudently addressed him with tender words, privately asking, "What is this, Geoffrey? Why art thou contrary to thy wont, thus pensive and sorrowful?" Then he, with a heavy sigh, made answer, "Alas, my brother, never in my lifetime shall I taste joy again." The other, being moved to pity by his words, with fraternal zeal, hastened to inform their common father, St. Bernard, of what had passed. Bernard, perceiving the danger, entered a church hard by in order to pray for him. Meanwhile, Geoffrey, overcome with sadness, reclined his head against a stone and fell asleep. But after a little while both arose, one imbued with the grace of prayer, and the other waking from his slumber with so serene and cheerful a countenance that his friend, marveling at so great and sudden a change, could not refrain from gently reproaching him with the words he had so lately uttered. Whereupon Geoffrey answered, "If then I told thee that I should never be glad, now I assure thee that I shall never be sorrowful." Such was the effect of temptation on this pious man, and I would have you thence observe, 1. That God generally gives to those who enter his service some foretaste of heavenly glory, in order to lead them from earthly delights and to encourage them in the pursuit of divine love. 2. That it is equally this good God who occasionally, in his wisdom, takes from us the milk and honey of consolation, in order that then we may learn to eat the dry but solid bread of a vigorous devotion, practiced amidst the trials of disgust and temptation. 3. That sometimes fierce temptations arise out of these drynesses and sterilities, and that we must steadily resist these temptations, but the dryness we must bear patiently, since God has appointed it for our trial. 4. That we must never lose our courage amidst our inward troubles, nor say with the good Geoffrey, "I shall never be happy," for during the night we should await the day, and even so, amidst the brightest spiritual sunshine, we should never say, "I shall never be sad," but as the wise man says, "In the days of good things, be not unmindful of evils." Ecclesiasticus chapter 11, verse 27. Hope amidst trials and fear amidst prosperity, and in both always humble yourself. 6. That our sovereign remedy is to discover our grief to some spiritual friend who is able to console us. And finally, I would observe that, as in all other things, so here our merciful God and our great enemy have opposite aims. For by these trials God would lead us to great purity of heart, to enter to entire renunciation of our own interest where his service is concerned, and to a perfect setting aside of self. Satan would convert them rather into occasions of discouragement, to make us fall back upon sensual delights, as also to make us wearisome to ourselves and to others, thereby to decry and disgrace the flame of holy devotion. But if you follow the counsels I have given you, you will greatly increase your perfection by the trials you undergo amidst these inward afflictions, of which I would say yet one more word. Sometimes disinclination, dryness, and barrenness of heart proceed from bodily indisposition, as when, owing to an excess in watching, fasting, and labor, we are overcome with lassitude, drowsiness, heaviness, and similar infirmities. Although these depend upon the state of the body, still they hinder the mind, the two being so closely linked together. Now, when such is the case, we should strive to perform sundry acts of virtue with the full strength of the mind and will, for although the soul may seem to be slumbering, overpowered with weariness and exhaustion, yet these mental acts are still highly acceptable to God. And at such times we may say with the bride, I sleep, but my heart waketh. Canticle chapter 5, verse 2. And as I said before, if there is less pleasure in such exertions, there is more merit. But the fitting remedy in such a case is to reinvigorate the body by means of some lawful relaxation and recreation. It was one of St. Francis's rules for his religious that they should always keep their labors within such bounds as never to overwhelm the fervor of their spirit. This holy father himself was once assailed and troubled by so deep a melancholy that he could not conceal it in his exterior deportment. If he wished to converse with his monks, he was unable. If he absented himself from them, it did but make him worse. Abstinence and bodily mortifications overpowered him, and he found no relief in prayer. For 2 years he was in this condition, so that he appeared to be wholly forsaken of God. But at last, after he had endured the heavy storm in all humility, our Savior suddenly restored him to a happy tranquillity. Thus, God's chosen servants are subject to such trials, and those less worthy should not greatly marvel if they too are tried.